Hi, this is Richard Grieco for Run It Once Puzzle Solvers, and in this episode we're going to take a look at some of the variables which create the greatest necessity for imposition to adjust their strategy when checked to on the flop. So far we've spent a reasonable amount of time looking at hands contested between the button and the big blind, because that is the most common variant of the imposition pre-flop raiser scenario. But whilst it is the most frequently occurring, it's not the only one that you'll ever see, and it's necessary to consider how you might want to adjust your strategy if you end up in a completely different situation. Some of the main variables that have the greatest effect on the imposition player's strategy are pre-flop ranges. For example, how should we alter our strategy if instead of having opened from the button and having half our hands, we actually opened under the gun, and therefore our range is a lot tighter, and if big blind is playing correctly, his range is tighter as well. Whether or not the out of position player has a leading range also plays into things. If he chooses to play pure check, then you gain no information when he checks to you. If he does split his range between leading and checking, then when he checks to you, typically his range will have grown some amount weaker because it will have lost some of the higher value hands that he would have led. And things also change considerably if either one of the players involved in the hand has a shorter stack than 100 big blinds. Once you get down to around 40, 50, 60 big blinds, it's necessary to make significant strategic alterations, otherwise you end up playing a strategy that's ill-equipped for the scenario that you're actually involved in. So let's start out by examining the effect that different pre-flop ranges can have. Firstly, as you tighten the imposition player's range, they start to do better and better on the ace-high boards. When the board is ace-high and the two players involved in the hand are button and big blind, then ace-high boards are certainly favourable to the imposition player, because typically speaking they'll benefit the player with the uncapped pre-flop range. But when the imposition player shifts from button to under the gun, that advantage increases to the point that the c-bet frequency increases from quite a lot of the time to essentially always, as we see on these two ace-high boards. Imposition is c-betting more than half the time when he's the button, and basically every single time when he's the under the gun player. Something pretty interesting happens if we take a look at the Broadway texture as we make the imposition player's range tighter, and that's that his c-bet frequency decreases. And the reason for this is because at equilibrium both parties are playing optimally pre-flop, and the out of position player has adjusted to the tighter range of his opponent by defending a lot tighter himself. Therefore, the out of position player connects significantly more favourably with these textures because his range has a higher density of high card hands. And so whilst imposition lacks some of the king-king, queen-queen, king-queen combinations because the very weakest have been folded pre-flop, the out of position player has every single one of the king-king, queen-queen combinations, quite a bit of the king-queen as well, and therefore is quite competitive in terms of polarity. Obviously, though, that assumption relies on the out-of-position player having a correctly constructed pre-flop range. As the big blind starts to defend wider and wider, the imposition player's advantage on these textures will again increase, as will his c-bet frequency. And the concept to emphasize here is that imposition c-bet frequency is going to go up and up and up on board textures where the pre-flop ranges are interacting in a way that results in extremely favorable asymmetries in equity or polarity. If there's an asymmetry in polarity, then the imposition player will have more nutted hands than their opponent, and as such will be able to apply a significant amount of flop pressure because their range will support that pressure continuing on through multiple streets, and therefore out of position, when considering what hands to defend on the flop, has to be conscious that the flop isn't the last street he's likely to face a high level of aggression on. If imposition has an increased equity advantage, that means that their range can support a reasonable amount of aggression because it has a high density of pretty strong hands, and pretty strong hands typically get to put some money into the pot, especially when the player with the pretty strong hands also has positional advantage. And if the board is one on which imposition enjoys a significant equity polarity advantage, then typically their range will also contain a high density of solid bluffing candidates. So they have a large number of different hand types that are highly incentivized to take aggressive action, and that also creates a kind of natural balance for the construction of their range. Not only will they be able to apply a lot of aggression on flop, turn, and river, but their range will be reasonably balanced when they do so, and the out of position player will have no clear exploit. Another variable which is going to necessitate strategic shifts for the in-position player is the presence or absence of leading range for the out-of-position player. There are many people who are just going to check their entire range when playing the role of the out-of-position player in a single-raise pot. And if you take a look at some equilibrium out-of-position strategies, quite often, if given the option, the out-of-position player will choose to lead at some frequency. And when out-of-position checks to us, if we know that he's checking his entire range, then we gain no information from that fact. But if he's splitting his range at his decision point between leading and checking, and he chooses to check to us, then that will result in our c-bet range looking very different to if we assume he's checked his entire range. Taking a look here at Queen 6-4 Rainbow under the gun versus Big Blind, Big Blind has quite a lot of interest in developing a leading range on this board texture because they're going to be quite competitive for polarity. Each player is going to have pretty similar amount of top set, but Big Blind's going to have more of the lower set combinations. They're also going to have a fair amount more of combinations that have a lot of equity on this board, like Queen 6, Queen 4, 7-5-3. And as such, a situation is developing where the out-of-position player is quite competitive for polarity, potentially even has a slight polarity advantage, but the in-position player, as they will on almost every board, has an equity advantage. And when the out-of-position player has a polarity advantage and the in-position player has an equity advantage, the out-of-position player is incentivized to develop a leading range because otherwise the in-position player can just trim streets from the betting. And as you get closer to showdown, the relative importance of equity to polarity increases. So trimming a street from the betting here works to the advantage of the in-position player in some way. And so Big Blind is incentivized to develop a leading range so that they don't always leave it up to the in-position player to determine whether money goes in on that street. In position, in response to an out-of-position check, is going to want to c-bet at a significantly different frequency depending on whether they've gained any information from the out-of-position player choosing not to bet. And so we see here, if we force out-of-position to just check their entire range, then in-position c-bets at a very low frequency, only 27% of their range. And that's because they know all of these things. They know that their advantage lies in equity rather than polarity. They know that out-of-position has a lot of high-value combinations, and they know they don't have all that many on this board. In-position is going to have, obviously, a lot more of combinations like aces and kings, but those are combinations that do best at showdown as opposed to in a potential three-street betting game. So in-position bets at a very low frequency unless out-of-position splits between leading and checking. If out-of-position does that, then when they check, their range grows some amount weaker, such that in-position gets to do more c-betting. Now, at least at equilibrium, there doesn't seem to be any one hand class that's particularly sensitive to the presence or absence of an out-of-position leading frequency when determining an in-position c-bet frequency. We basically see less c-betting across the board. In reality, it's probably a decent idea to c-bet a little bit more polarized in the situation where out-of-position has no leading range. The hands that get punished the most as you strengthen the range that you're betting into are the ones with pretty high EV check, so kind of like the mid-strength hands, maybe like King 6-4, mediocre Queen X. Those hands might be more incentivized to c-bet when out-of-position's range becomes weaker as a consequence of checking when they have a leading range, and will opt to do a fair amount less betting in the situation where out-of-position is just checking everything. It is worth pointing out that all of this is predicated upon out-of-position reacting to an in-position c-bet with a pretty aggressive counter strategy, continuing reasonably often, check raising at a pretty high frequency, and so on. If that's not happening, then obviously we can significantly decrease the scale of the adjustment we're making. If out of position is checking everything to us, but also under check raising, then our c-bet frequency can certainly go up from where it is at equilibrium. Another variable which exerts considerable impact on how a hand plays is the stack to pot ratio. A hand's going to play out very differently if the SPR's 1 than if it's 100. And typically, as the SPR grows lower and lower, the out of position player is going to have more and more interest in developing a leading range. That's going to mean that when they check, their range is potentially a little bit weaker and more polar. Their check raise range is going to become more value heavy because the incentive to check call stronger made hands decreases, and the ability to check raise hands like 2-pair with a bunch of bad runouts on a dynamic board goes up. So check raise range looks very linear and value heavy. Check call range typically is a little bit more exposed, but the in-position player has less of an ability to punish that to a significant extent as the SPR grows lower. As the in-position player then, facing out-of-position check, we're often going to want to decrease our c-bet sizing. A larger one is no longer required in order to get all the money in by the river with a bet line. If out-of-position is check raising quite aggressively and never bluffing, then a small c-bet can also be used to gain potentially useful information. And as the SPR decreases, our ability to leverage positional advantage also goes down. So sizing down our flop c-bet can reduce the effect that has and allow us to have some amount of maneuverability still on turns if action goes check, bet, call. We're going to want to do considerably more checking with hands that lose a lot of EV if check raised, potentially have to bet fold at shorter stack sizes. At deeper stack sizes, these hands often have factors working in their favor, such as implied odds or the ability to maneuver well based on the presence of certain key cards in their hand at deeper SPR to overrealize their equity. So hands which rely on factors beyond raw equity in order to make their money are typically going to want to do more checking as we decrease the SPR because the weight of those factors decreases. And as a consequence of that, we get to be a lot less aggressive with hands which are going to make nut blockers on future texture shifts. Taking as an example our c-bet frequency with jack-jack combinations that are no better than pocket aces and don't have a legitimate open-ended or gut-shot straight draw, you can see that we're going to do more and more c-betting with these hands as we have greater and greater SPR to play with on future streets. At shorter stacks, the impact of these blockers decreases because out of position's stack-off requirements will also go down, so blocking the nuts is less relevant when our opponent doesn't require a hand as good as the nuts in order to put all the money in. Whereas as we start playing deeper and deeper stacked, our ability to apply leverage across multiple streets increases, and therefore we're going to initiate that process by developing a more aggressive flop c-betting strategy. So in summary then, as preflop ranges create larger and larger asymmetries of equity and polarity on given boards, in-position is going to do more and more c-betting. If you know that you're playing a hand against someone who doesn't have a leading range, then you're going to want to adjust your c-bet frequency downwards and trim some of the more mergy mid-strength hands from your aggression range. As the SPR decreases, you're typically going to want to decrease your c-bet sizing as the in-position player and also make your strategy more about the equity a given hand has rather than the EV it may later acquire. There's a very strong correlation between equity and EV as the stack sizes decrease. Typically, those two values converge ever more closely as the SPR grows smaller and smaller. And strongly related to that, as one specific example, as the stack sizes grow shallower and shallower, the less important it is to either block the current nuts or have the potential to block the nuts on a future texture shift. That's all for this time. See you in the next episode.